Something watches me from the corner of my eye. It's not my brother. Within this little house, my brother, mother, and I make up its residence. My brother and I spend our days within this home, sparsely conversing as we both enjoy our own solitude. But when we do speak, the sun is either rising or setting when we've finished. My mother labors long hours in a clothing store not far from our home, and so, she is absent from home most of the day. It had been a few months prior when I first saw my visitor. He observed me from the doorway of my room, wordlessly, whilst I played a video game. I had the initial thought that it was my brother. Perhaps he wanted to tell me something, but by the time I managed to confirm my suspicion, I found my door closed and the presence of anyone was absent. I remember thinking that my brother had just lost his patience, and so he left to return to his own affairs. In the wake of that thought, a notification alarmed me that I had found a new match. Therefore, I continued playing, and the events of that moment left the surface of my consciousness, patiently waiting to be recalled. The occurrence of these strange visitations increased over the following days. I was catching, at first, faint glimpses of someone standing just around the perimeter of my vision, someone who usually resembled either my brother or my mother, so I never paid much attention to these occurrences. In my current hindsight, I can see the relation to what I'm about to say, but at the time, I hadn't been perceptive enough to make any connections with what had been happening. I would hear a distant calling, from somewhere in the house or outside in the yard. I would hear my name from a voice like that of my mother or sometimes my brother, as I listened to music, watched a video, or had my ears filled with any sort of, I could say, noise. It disconcerted me, not only because when I consulted with them, I would be told that I wasn't called for, or at times, when I heard my mother, she wouldn't even be at home, but because I began ignoring the actual calls of my mother and brother much later on. Over the past few weeks, that strange watcher would do what he did best, vainly, as I gave him neither attention nor a place in my very own train of thought. And though he bore resemblance to my mother, and at times, my brother, their behaviors could not be compared. It seemed that minutes would pass, and his presence would remain. I would watch entire videos, and it was as though he watched for my reaction to the video. Though I would have liked it, his presence was not confined to my room, but he watched from any place, and at any time, whether I was cooking, training, or even in the most intimate of times showering, or looking after my basic human needs. I would be reminded of his existence at every moment I paid attention to the perimeter of my eyes. I lived out a most discomforting and frustrating existence. However, life remained that way long enough for me to grow accustomed. So, I would not have begun writing this post if things were as I just described, which unfortunately, they aren't. Initially, I arrived at the incomplete, but at the time, comforting conclusion that perhaps this was just some form of pareidolia, or just something small that I would need to see a therapist to sort out. I would say, financially, my situation is one to be wary of, so I'm prudent about my spending. Therefore, I lived with the belief that I could sort this out much later, when I'm able to, and that for the instant, I could just tough it out, bite the bullet, walk it off. Point is, I thought I could just endure. The sun rose and fell a couple of times, and the calls had grown faint, and whoever was staring at me had been absent for some time. I recall the moon being high and on watch. I was in the middle of having finished a match in my game and entering one, and at first, I hadn't the slightest clue what I was seeing. The wall beside my monitor had this white blotch protruding outward, like a half-buried marble. My ability to not see that which is in my vision is quite exceptional, and I had employed it in that very moment, and gone to retrieve a beverage from my refrigerator. I remember how cold to the touch it was. I was excited at the prospect of drinking it. I was going to my room to do just that, but blocking the hallway stood a figure. I hadn't an immediate recollection of this figure. I thought perhaps it was my brother. That thought was rapidly abandoned when I saw its face. And I address that thing as it now, because that thing was no person, no man, no woman, no human being, and I couldn't even tell if it had life, or even cared for it. But at that moment, my heart felt a subdued panic that was slowly welling up my throat into the scream that had drawn my brother out of his room. The entire time he spoke with me, it stood over him, completely unnoticed by my brother, though part of me is glad that he doesn't have to see that abomination, no longer in the perimeter of my eyes, but in its forefront. And no more were the days in which it disappeared when my eyes tried to scrutinize it. It stood boldly before me, its face a muddy mess of skin, no distinguishing features, or even orifices to consume or respire from. The shape of its head was entirely ambiguous, and I now saw with strain why I mistook it for my brother and mother. But what remained unclear was how hadn't I noticed its paper white, polished skin until this very moment. From our first encounter in the hall onward, I've not had the peace of a mere second of solitude in its absence. It's now crossed the boundary of the perimeter of my vision into the center of my focus, with boldness. Even as I write, it permeates through the wall with only its head facing mine, observing me. No eyes in its head, yet it sees me, it perceives me. Does anyone know what I can do to rid myself of its presence?